CGTN, China Global Television Network.
China's annual political season has come to a close this week. Popularly known as the Two Sessions, the two-week convergence of delegates and deputies in Beijing culminated in a host of political, economic and foreign policy measures designed to steer China's development and international relations in the coming year. So amidst a changing international landscape and new domestic realities, what direction will China's foreign policy take? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. After 2 weeks of political consultations and legislative actions in Beijing, major announcements covering both domestic and foreign policies came out of this year's Two Sessions. Now, last Tuesday, Premier Li Keqiang delivered China's 2019 government work report. Among the key issues addressed in the report was China's economic growth target for the coming year. Set between 6 and 6.5%, it reflects a slowdown in the growth of the Chinese economy. Now, China's new foreign investment law has also come into effect as Beijing reiterates its commitment to negotiations and fair competition in addressing the ongoing trade hurdles with the United States. Chinese State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi answered questions on China's foreign policy agenda. He reaffirmed the Belt and Road Initiative as an opportunity for shared development with other countries of the world.
To date, 123 countries and 29 international organizations have signed BRI agreements with China. They have cast a vote of support and confidence in the BRI. From the start, the BRI follows the sound principle of consultation and cooperation for shared benefits. It has created enormous opportunities for all participants.
The international cooperation between China and Africa was also emphasized by Wang Yi, who called on the global community to increase their efforts to promote development in Africa. The close of the Two Sessions was marked by Premier Li Keqiang's annual presser on Friday. Well, let's broaden this discussion a little bit more. I'm joined by Victor Gao in Beijing. He's an international relations expert and director at the China National Association of International Studies. Dr. David Monyae in Johannesburg is joining me from there. He's the co-director of the Confucius Institute at the University of Johannesburg. And with me in studio, David Owiro, an independent consultant economist based in Nairobi. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining in this conversation. Victor Gao, first to you.
Thank you.
State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi addressed the press on the sidelines of the Two Sessions, and a few issues stood out. He reiterated China's view on multilateralism. He talked about the Belt and Road Initiative, which will be a major focus in China this year, and he also talked about China's body of diplomatic theories with Chinese characteristics. Do expound this for us. What does it mean, though, a foreign policy with Chinese characteristics?
When you talk about the Chinese foreign affairs with Chinese characteristics, this is a very important part of China today because China's foreign policy is very much unique to China. China is a non-aligned country. China is very much independent in its foreign affairs. And also, China seeks peace and wants to maintain domestic stability by promoting economic development. And China is always trying to get as many friends as possible rather than comparing with other countries which seem to be very much concerned whether they have enough enemy or not. So I think this is very much characteristic of China, seeking peace, seeking development, treating every country as an equal and try to be friends and brothers and sisters with people of all the countries, including in all the African countries.
Victor, just to elaborate on what you talked about China now pursuing multilateralism, would you say that Chinese foreign policy is getting more vocal, is getting more stronger? How do you see this, though, shaping the world today?
Well, first of all, China is now the second largest economy by official exchange rate and already the largest economy if we use the purchasing power parity as the benchmark. And China is the largest trading nation with more than 130 countries around the world. In a sense, the Chinese economic activities have an impact on all corners of the world, and China's international influence and impact are increasing as we speak. This is very natural with a very much expanding China. On the other hand, I think the key is that China wants to treat itself as an equal to all the other countries in the world, and China does not want to exploit other countries, and by doing trade, it's a sign of getting equal treatment with each other. And for example, 2018, China held the first international import summit, which is a great success, and China is very much encouraging and promoting import from all countries in the world into China. China's consumer market is already the largest one in the world. So going forward, there will be more and more and larger demand coming out of China for goods and services throughout the world.
Dr. Monyae, let's get your view, because you did listen to the foreign minister's presser on the sidelines of the two sessions. In your view, though, what is the key message that has come out of the two sessions?
I think there are a number of messages that one had. One, it has to do with changes that are taking place within China itself, mainly changing of the regulatory framework in terms of foreign company investment laws that are going to change. And we had quite clearly that China continued commitment in terms of engaging the entire world, particularly the African continent, that all agreements that were signed and all activities that are taking place, regardless of the global kind of depression at economic level, China will continue participating jointly with African countries in terms of dealing with infrastructure and all other investments. When it comes to multilateral and foreign policy, I think there are quite a number of areas where Africa finds itself getting along on key points with China. And as you are aware, it goes back to 1955 with the Bandung summit, where African countries and Asian countries agreed on the need to transform the global system and the global order to ensure that it is more representative, it is more fair, and it's more democratic. That's where Africa shares with China's position on continued engagement on issues of peacekeeping and ensuring that we have a better world. And
David, your take.
Yes, certainly. I concur with the comments from my colleagues. I think what I can add is from an economic standpoint, we see broad recognition from the leadership in China that indeed the economic slowdown, global economic slowdown, is due partly to Chinese economic activities. And they've taken steps to sort of address some of those risks and challenges that they see. Key among those is tax reforms, where they seek to increase the buying power of the Chinese population through reduction of taxes. They've also instituted targets, broad economic targets for GDP growth for the year, basically revising downwards. Last year they had performed at about 6.6% GDP. This year they projected to perform between 6 and 6.5. So basically recognizes that indeed there's an economic downturn, but in spite of that, the country will still attain the targets they've set out. I think lastly, the thing that also stands out for me from an economic standpoint is the recognition that their budget deficit for this year is going to be higher than last year, going to about 2.8%. So these are all, of course, reassuring to the global community. Because we know that, given the economic slowdown, if they do take action, then certainly there would be an upward trend or there are hopes of an upward trend towards the end of the year.
So we're going to look at the slowdown of the Chinese economy in a minute and its impact on Africa's projects. But first, Victor, I still want to come back to you, though, regarding exactly how differently China expects to or hopes to proceed in the future. We've seen world powers such as Britain, come and go on the world stage with Brexit. We've seen the United States becoming a bit more inward-looking, though. What is unique, though, about China's approach? Because China says it is still going to be trying to grow global growth for the emerging countries, as well as develop its own domestic requirements. What is unique about China's situation?
I think as far as China is concerned, we still believe several megatrends are very important. Globalization, or continued globalization, is a very big, important megatrend, not only for China, but for mankind as a whole. And modernization, continued reform, continued opening up to the outside world. So I think as far as China is concerned, we are still growing. We are still very much opening up to the outside world. We want to promote a more connected world. Now, indeed, there are several very developed countries which are very much concerned about the consequences of globalization. Some country even wants to build a wall to hide behind an artificial wall and to disregard the realities or the consequences of global warming, for example. China is very much different. China still wants to be a champion in terms of our efforts fighting against the consequences of global warming, and we want to be a champion of environmental protection. And as far as Africa is concerned, many countries in Africa today probably are more developed than China was 40 years ago. So China is unique in the sense that we have the experience. We've gone through all these phases and stages of development, and we are very much assured that Africa's tomorrow can be a very bright tomorrow, because China came through the whole process and we benefited from stability, peace, and focus on development, opening to the outside world, modernization and urbanization, for example. All these experiences are relevant to our brothers and sisters in Africa, and I think we want to see more growth, not only here in China, but in Africa and in other parts of the world.
David Owiro, there are lessons that Africa can borrow from China's experiences, particularly now that you talk about, China's economy. Where do you see Africa taking advantage and learning from China's previous situation, as Victor Gao has mentioned?
Yeah, certainly. I think one of the megatrends that has been talked about is the globalization. Of course, we know Africa has one big challenge of economic development, and even when it comes to matters such as trade, Africa's trade by itself is only at 18%. And so when you talk about globalization, Africa looks to increase its integration with the global economy. And to do that, of course, China offers support, as well as other development actors, to not only for Africa to upgrade their infrastructure, but also to improve and modernize the traditional sectors. And so I think key lessons for Africa, of course, are that if China, through an export-oriented economic model was able to, increase its exports to the world and use that to industrialize, then Africa can as well as do that. We know that Africa trades within itself mostly value added, and therefore the push by African nations to have increased inter-African trade actually can result in not only industrialization, but also great opportunities for employment, as well as opportunities for achieving the industrialization dream.
Dr. David Monyae, there are clearly profound shifts that are taking place in the geopolitical sphere in the world, and as a result, of course, of the changing aspects of multilateralism and globalization. How is Africa, though, viewing China's global ascendancy through its foreign policy?
Africa is quite interested in working with China on a number of fronts. I think it is to do with China as a former developing country, that all developments as viewed from this meeting, the political meeting of Chinese leaders and lawmakers, that China has set a key goals to deal with poverty alleviation. I think it's one of the major crises on the African continent, that so many Africans are living beyond poverty line. And therefore, China has managed to uplift 700 million people out of poverty since 1978 in a number of key areas: agriculture, infrastructure development, education, the health system. So all these factors, I think, are factors in which Africa wants to learn and observe how China did it, as well as put it in an African context. So those are major concerns coming from the African continent.
All right, gentlemen, we'll leave it there for the moment, but we'll take a short break. To stay tuned, the conversation continues right here on Talk Africa in a moment. Stay tuned.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington, and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms, and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. My guests today, Dr. David Monyae, is joining us from Johannesburg, Victor Gao in Beijing for us, and David Owiro still with me in studio. Let's now continue with this discussion. Dr. David Monyae, one of the other areas of focus during the 2 sessions was the Belt and Road Initiative, and there will be a Belt and Road Initiative summit that will take place in April this year in Beijing. First off, for Africa though, what is the progress that has been made within the BRI since the first summit in 2017?
I think there have been major milestones achieved. When you look at infrastructure development on the African continent, which is related to the BRI, if we go to Ethiopia and see the kind of progress that has been made, the rail belt between Ethiopia and Djibouti, and we have in Kenya, right where you are, Mombasa, Nairobi, and potential shoots of the same infrastructure into Uganda, Rwanda, and Tanzania. There's a huge potential to spread on the continent. And there are more chances for countries in Southern Africa to join in the BRI. And therefore, I think for Africa, this is great news that Africa need to participate within the BRI with an aim of ensuring that African goods reach the Chinese market and beyond within the global value chain. Africa need to prosper with the development of BRI, so that our thinking need to ensure that at the African Union, with the African Union Agenda 2063, to ensure that the Belt Road Initiative, it's aligned to Africa's own thinking around the issue of infrastructure, which is quite clear. There are no ambiguities. Therefore, one is expecting more activities that will create more employment and ensure that the education, health improves, and secondary industrialization could take place as what was happened with China's development since 1978. Infrastructure played a critical role in opening up the Chinese economy and Chinese people to prosper.
David, one of the issues, though, that has been affected in the 2019 summit, though, will be the participation of the business community. There will be a section for the business community participation. What do you see, though, as the role of the private sector, particularly in Africa, in actualizing the BRI?
Yeah, certainly there's quite a significant role. Of course, governments will put in place policies. These policies have to be implemented well, and part of that implementation means that there has to be compliance from the private sector. So from a starting point, the private sector has to be aware of the opportunities that exist within these trading arrangements that are now being put in place. Secondly, one of the biggest challenges that faces our export commodities and our export opportunities to do with standards. We know to access certain markets in the world, not only in China, you need to have goods of particular standards. And more often than not, the business community are the ones that are supposed to actually adhere to those standards. And so one of the key points of knowledge transfer is actually around technologies and e-commerce opportunities that will ensure that we not only are able to keep up with the standards that are required, but we are also able to exploit the opportunities that do arise coming out of these opportunities of trading frameworks.
Right. Victor, David did mention earlier on about the slowing down of the Chinese economy. And of course, many in Africa will be wondering whether the slowdown of China's economy will impact projects such as the BRI and other infrastructural projects that have made a huge impact in opening up the continent. What impact, though, will the slowing down of the economy have on projects such as the BRI on the continent?
Well, first of all, indeed, the growth rate of the Chinese economy is slowing down. Last year, 2018, it was around 6.5%. And the forecast for this year, 2019, it will be about 6 to 6.5%. It's coming down. However, because the size of the Chinese economy has increased significantly, the same percentage growth means a much larger additional addition to the Chinese economy. So when we look at the GDP growth, it's one thing, but we also need to look at the net increase or the net addition to the Chinese economy. So we need to be very objective about that. Now, secondly, China is still very much in need of many things from many parts of the world, especially from Africa. And I think China has set up many open zones in Africa, for example, working very closely with our brothers and sisters in many parts of Africa to do what the Chinese did 40 years ago or 30 years ago when we opened up to the outside world, when we started manufacturing and building up of our industry. And I would say the One Belt, One Road, talking about connectivity, for example, is not only about connectivity in terms of the highways, railways, ports, airports, for example. It also involves financial connectivity,
right,
and also cyber connectivity. So I think we are talking about a more and more connected Africa. African countries or different regions of Africa need to be connected, and this will bring down the cost of doing business and making sure that the exchange and flow of goods, services, capital, and people will be very much accelerated. And this will bring in higher speed for the growth in Africa. And I think China will be very much involved in working very closely with our African brothers and sisters. And also allow me to emphasize very briefly, China does not want to do it all by itself, because other countries, if, for example, the United States or Japan or EU members, for example, if they also want to participate, the more the better. I think Africa needs the intervention and the involvement and participation of all the developed parts of the world. The more the better. Dr.
David Monyae, though, certainly the BRI has triggered a lot of development, infrastructural on the continent, but there are those who claim that it is creating a debt trap for Africa. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's quite problematic, and one finds some of the criticism leveled against Africans as patronizing, that Africans don't think enough, unable to negotiate, and a sense that Africa cannot choose its own friends. You need Western hand to help Africa in dealing with its own friends. But having said that, we also have to acknowledge that the largest debt that Africa has with the world, it is with Western world. And most of that debt had nothing to do with development. And up to now, we haven't seen any benefit.
Right. David, what are your thoughts, though, regarding Africa and its alleged debt trap as a result of Chinese projects?
Well, I think this is a disease that perhaps hasn't been well diagnosed. In my mind, if you look at the challenges that many countries are going through in Africa, they arise from fiscal policy pressures. And so it's purely a public financial management question. Most of the countries, if you talk about South Africa, if you talk about Nigeria, if you talk about Kenya and Ethiopia, are facing a lot of fiscal policy constraints in the form of not only increasing debt loads, but also, state-owned corporations that perhaps are not delivering what they are supposed to be delivering. And so there's essentially a crisis to do with how to finance budgets, and most budgets running into large deficits. And so it's not only a debt issue. Debt is just a very small fraction of the challenge that African countries are facing. And so if you look at it that way, and then you begin to diagnose, okay, so what are indeed the sources, even when it comes to debt? As Dr. Monyae has stated, largely the debt that Africa has is from either IMF and World Bank debts. And so if you want to talk about a debt crisis or a debt trap, then China should not be the first thing that props up. It should be looked at within the context of, what is the portfolio of debt that most of these countries have, and what is the quality of that debt.
Victor Gao, you have the final word.
I think in 2019, working more on connectivity and infrastructure for African countries is very important. Industrialization and increasing manufacturing capacities, national capacity building, for example, are very, very important. And on top of that, always remember, maintaining stability and keeping peace will be the precondition for any meaningful development in any country. And of course, anti-corruption will be a key for stability too in all the countries in Africa.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your insights. Thank you to my guests for sharing their insights. Victor Gao in Beijing, international relations expert and director at the China National Association of International Studies. Dr. David Monyae in Johannesburg, the co-director of the Confucius Institute at the University of Johannesburg. And with me in studio, David Owiro, independent consultant, economist based in Nairobi. Remember to keep the conversation going online through Facebook and our Twitter handle. And do also catch the previous episodes of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist and the CGTN Africa website. Remember to tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team in Nairobi, it's goodbye.